Yeah, good evening. Welcome. Welcome to this third episode of TechTalk Dudes. Today Pim and we are the host for this third session. And this third session, we are going deep dive into enterprise applications, app registrations, and so on. These days, cloud technology is common. Azure AD is very well used, and actually Azure AD provides a lot of capabilities. It is an identity provider to authentication, authorization, and granting access. It provides zero trust concept like conditional access, multi-factor authentication. There is way too much what Azure AD provides, and one of the most important things is that Azure AD can be extended, and you can extend Azure AD with applications. And there are multiple ways how you can extend Azure AD. You have enterprise applications, you might heard about it, app registrations, but it's not always clear what actually the differences between those applications and what is the use case for them. And that's today, Pim will go into more details. What are exactly the differences? What are the challenges? What are the pitfalls? How you can protect them? So that's actually the topic of this session. So yeah, I'm quite interested, Pim.
Thanks for this introduction, Ronnie. Very well described, as I would recall. Enterprise applications and app registrations in Azure AD, and app consents, etc. How does that work? Well, let's first start with just a general thing about enterprise applications and app registration, because in some cases there is a lot of confusion about what is what actually. And an enterprise application, in simple words, is a service principal. That's what an enterprise application is. If you're going to look it up with PowerShell, you will be able to find your enterprise application with the commandlet get Azure AD service principal by filtering on the object AD. Looking at the app registration, that's actually an application. So if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do a lookup via PowerShell, I will do that with the command get Azure AD application. So in the most simple words, an app registration is an application, and an enterprise app is a service principal. So I can share the screen because I think that's helpful for a bit more explanation.
Yes, certainly.
Let me find the screen. It's this one.
Yes.
So this is my tenant. You can see my screen, Ronnie?
Yep, bring it on.
Check.
See a lot of applications over there.
Exactly. So those are the enterprise applications which do reside within my personal tenant. And you can see there is a lot of general apps which are in here, like Office 365 Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Jammer, Teams, Intune as well. So those are the things which you get by default. If you create a tenant, these are already in there. Looking at the ones which you can add is something you can do by hitting the button new application. And in here you can search the gallery, like for example, and this is something which will come back later on. If I search for Slack, because I have Slack, I can find it, I can click on that one, I can see, it supports SAML for single sign-on, it supports provisioning, and if I click on this, the predefined things which are, from a general perspective, supported within Slack are already added. So the claims, etc., I don't have to make them by default, they're already in there, what's supported with Slack, and it even gives you a link to the docs page, how you can set this up from scratch by following just the simple steps explained in this docs article. So that's the advance of one of the advantages of a gallery app. Now, unfortunately, not all apps are listed in here. like AFAS, for example, it's an ASR system. It's not in this list. And then I have to click on create my own application, which you can find on the left top corner. And then you can select the one which you want to add. Now, in here, there are 3 choices. Configure the application proxy for secure remote access. That's when you want to provision an on-premise app. Register an application you're working on to integrate with Azure AD, like an OAuth app, or integrate any other application you cannot find in a gallery. Now, if I, just as the example, would say I want to hit create AFAS, it again gives me suggestions, the same as you can find here, because maybe you missed it or made a typo with the search, and you can hit create, and then it will create the enterprise application, basically the service principal and application, because it's a combination in this case, in the Azure AD, and you can start configuring, for example, the single sign-on with SAML, just as an example.
Yeah. With single sign-on, you mean when you have an Azure AD account, you are able to log into Azure AD, and because of SAML support, you will also directly be able to access this application without being prompted for logging in there.
Exactly. So once I connect this application to the Azure AD, just by adding, for example, Slack to my Azure AD, I don't do anything with the Slack app itself. I need to make the configuration changes on both ends.
Yeah.
So, within Slack and Azure AD, I basically, well, some people call it federate, some people call it connect, more different wordings you can recall for that. And then with your Azure AD account, basically, you can log on to your identity, which resides within Slack. Single sign-on experience or seamless, it's logging on automatically into that app. And then in that case, at that point in time, the identity provider for Slack is Azure AD.
Yeah, it's redirecting.
Exactly. And the biggest advantage, because a lot of people still are using ADFS for this, which is, well, the concept is the same, although the security measures which you can take with Azure AD are much broader and bigger than ADFS has built in. And on the other hand, ADFS is a platform, well, from a security perspective, it's maintained, but new features are coming earlier in Azure AD, and maybe they don't even come anymore in ADFS.
Yeah, so it's more legacy. It's still there. It's still valid. It's still supported, but all the new good things are integrated in Azure AD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why you can do this. And then once you've added this one, so I won't go and configure this one right now, because that will be an example of an app, and I've already described one on my blog, so it's very app specific. But the nice thing is that I can, if I hit on conditional access from the enterprise app, or just via the regular security blade go to conditional access, I can create a new policy in here.
Azure AD is busy.
Yeah, or my laptop is. And then, as you can see, the app AFAS, which I just added, I can do with it within conditional access whatever I want to. So it's quite easy to apply security measures, like, just as an example, require MFA, mark the device to be compliant from Intune, or hybrid Azure AD joint, or yeah, maybe you do want to require a password change when you access this app, but that's a little bit of a weird example in this case. Or maybe you even want to block access from specific sites for this app. You only want to be accessed from, for example, the Netherlands or Belgium, or whatever country you can name, or maybe a specific IP. So that's the biggest advantage when moving apps to the Azure AD. And on top of that, in the end, passwordless would be a great benefit, of course. But let's not go too deep into passwordless, because otherwise something else for session.
That's actually what I mentioned in the introduction. Azure AD is a platform, and you can easily extend it with your own applications or applications from the gallery. And one of the biggest advantages you are showing now is you have a seamless way of conditional access, multi-factor authentication. You have the ability to log sign-ins, etc. So there are no surprises how applications are utilized. I can see you are also able to grant users access to those. I'm assuming it's also based on group memberships, dynamic group memberships. So I think it's really impressive.
Yeah, and this is just the gallery app. So when looking at, for example, an on-premises app, because that's what I just have one example in here, and I won't go over the properties, the owners, the roles, and the users, and I will just start with single sign-on, because this is using an on-premises app which is using Windows integrated authentication. So imagine you have a web page which is using Windows integrated authentication in your environment, and you want to secure that with Azure AD conditional access. That's possible and actually quite simple to do, because what you do need is you need an app proxy server in your environment, which basically has a tunnel open with the Azure AD, on which you as a user can travel back via the Azure AD, and it's using an SPN in the Active Directory to maintain the single sign-on. So in this example, it's very simple. I think I need to swap screen sharing, but it's very simple. It's just an IIS web page which does Windows integrated authentication. Let me share the screen a bit different. So this is the, oh wait, that's the machine itself. I don't want to go to this one. This is the Azure AD proxy server. And I will just close this window.
Yeah, so this is on-premise on your internal network, and it has the connector installed.
Yeah, and if I go to that, from that Azure AD proxy machine to the URL, it will show me a Windows prompt. It was just on the screen, so maybe I...
Yeah, so you're now directly internally accessing your website.
Well, it should be.
So that's one of the prerequisites. So when you have the Azure AD connector installed, it should be routable to your web application you're publishing.
I'm not sure what happened with the VM, but you just saw the Windows integrated authentication prompt, and then once you open the Azure Active Directory, in here, you can go to the URL which is published by the proxy. By the way, you can see that from the application proxy stuff in here. So this is the URL which is proxy to. It's currently an MSI proxy.net URL, because if I do want to have something on my public domain names, it's HTTPS, and I do require a certificate, and I don't have.
This is the public. This is the public URL.
And this is the internal URL. And the internal URL is secured with Windows integrated authentication. The external URL is published via the proxy. I set up pre-authentication, so I authenticate in Azure AD, eventually with conditional access. I'm using an SPN within my Active Directory to fix that single sign-on, and then that SPN is used by Azure Active Directory to actually log on the user within the Windows integrated app.
Yeah.
So that's another way to do single sign-on. So you have SAML, you have OpenID Connect, but you also have Windows integrated Windows authentication, which is in Azure AD, which you can use to easily publish an internal application with SSO via the Azure AD. So the options are actually quite big. So it's not just an app which needs to talk SAML or whatever else. You can do much more things with it. Then looking to go a bit further, because eventually you have users in the Azure AD. To go a bit further, you can even provision users from the Azure AD to your app, so that eventually when your user processes how should I call it? Okay, so when the user is created within AD or Azure AD or it's synced, it doesn't really matter. The user is also provisioned in the app itself, and not each app does support this. So it requires, from Azure AD, it requires Skim. There are ways to work around that with third-party tools, like the partnership Microsoft has enclosed with Aquera. But once it does support Skim, I can, and Slack was supported as we saw at the start. I can easily just enable this for my end users, and I can even create mappings between Azure Active Directory fields and Slack, in this case, attribute fields, where I can easily provision a user when it's just from the point where it's a starter, or I can deprovision a user once it leaves the organization. So it's basically can save you money if you implement this in the right way, because Slack, in this case, is based on subscription on active users. So it's a subscription which I pay for monthly. Now, once you got this in place right, make sure that the user has been assigned to the app, because that's where the provisioning feature in Azure AD is looking at. And then you can turn it on. And if you look at the logs, in this case, you can see 2 users are provisioned, but I just provisioned one. If I just, let's filter this on success. I can see that Ronnie, for example, was added correctly to Slack. Yeah. I can even see all green marks. I can see the modified properties. So you were already in there, and you can see that active has changed from false to true. So the old value was disabled and the new is enabled. So basically, I have to pay for you now, Ronnie.
Okay, wow, that's always good.
Free Slack for you. Anyway, that's how this actually works. And if you look into the back end of Slack, you will be able to see that your account was not. Oh wait, on the client side.
So actually, yeah.
I'm just wondering. Settings and administration, workspace settings. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Slack. As you can see, so as you can see in here right now, this is my admin account. I'm paying for Johnny Bravo. He's inactive. My admin account is inactive as well because I don't have to pay for it. It's the primary owner, and you have become a full member, and your account has been activated. So it's all grabbing all this information from Azure AD. Basically, more is in here, but I'm not able to see that as an administrator, at least not from this point forward. So, and here you can see that you have been activated within Slack.
Yeah. So we don't only have the single sign-on seamless. It's also the access to provisioning to applications like Slack. And so I'm joining and your organization, I'm a member of it based on my role, and automatically my user account in Slack is also created
as well.
And can use Slack for multiple things.
Exactly. So that's basically the main part within enterprise applications.
Yeah, so with one account, I can access multiple applications. I don't have the overall management of user management for all my applications because it's governed or orchestrated by actually Azure AD because it supports provisioning. And you mentioned this is by default, and applications which are not able to support provisioning this way. You mentioned you have also other options like Skim, isn't it?
Well, this was Skim, which you just saw Skim, but there are indeed other ways to provision users within apps, like with LDAP, or maybe the app does support the connection to Active Directory. But you also have tools like Aquera, for example. And basically, the difference between why you do need Aquera is, in this case, Slack has a SCIM endpoint on the Slack end.
Yeah.
And Azure AD is then able to talk to Slack directly. If you put something in between, like Aquera, and Microsoft has enclosed a partnership with them, basically they will create the SCIM endpoint for you. So your app will talk to, can talk to Aquera, an example, and then Aquera can talk to the app. So it's more like bridging the gap, because that's basically what they are doing.
Yeah.
It's more like building a bridge between something which doesn't talk SCIM, so you can, and via Aquera, you can talk SCIM to the application. That's, in simple words,
what it does.
What it does. There are several ways, so this is just one of them. So, of course, there are 100 ways to do stuff like this, but this is just an example.
Yeah.
And I do like the provisioning, not only from Azure AD to apps, of course, but also from HR to the Azure AD and then to the app, because then your life cycle from Active Directory, Azure AD through the app is in one line, in simple words.
Yeah, it's end to end without having broke accounts and so on. And yeah,
exactly. So that's what enterprise apps is in general. Now, of course, we have a load of user settings. Microsoft has introduced, I think, in the last part of last year, they introduced some extra settings, and this is quite interesting if we want to go over it, because it provides some more security. Yeah, it's grayed out because I configured this. It's saying that. So within the enterprise applications, you got user settings, and from this page, I can actually make some settings. And this is not for the apps you create as an admin for your users, but more for the apps which are trying to access the profile on your behalf or data on your behalf. I think you can recall this, Ronnie, maybe not. That depends on how you connected it, but with Sessionize, for example, you can consent Sessionize to read your profile so that it has already a part of your data, like your display name, your profile, etc. So that's there, and this part which we're talking about right now is more like the consent to access, so that apps can access company data or personal information on their behalf. So on behalf of the user, actually.
Yeah, you're not doing then the consent on behalf of yourself, or are you then consenting on behalf of your organization? Because I can imagine if you're able to consent it on behalf of your organization, I'm not sure if your admins are allowing that. And from the other end, you're saying the Sessionize in this case are just reading your email, for example, or your personal information. But who guarantees that the application isn't reading all other information of your tenant?
Yeah.
You're talking about reading, but for example, it might have not only read access but also write access.
Yeah, that's totally true. Totally true, but even read is worse, because it depends on how you approve the access rights. But if it's to documents, they can access OneDrive, SharePoint data. So it's quite critical, actually, and people don't see this. But it depends on what you choose. So I will the difference between user and a global consent. I will come back to that just in a minute.
Yeah.
Let's surely go over the settings. So this setting is grayed out because I configured consents and permissions. So I will come back to that in a second. Now, users can consent to apps accessing company data for the groups they own. Now, that's not something I would like for company data for the groups they own. I would just want to do that for the user. So I set this value on purpose to no.
Yeah.
And then the important settings do come, like the ones which are in preview right now. Users can request admin consent to apps that they're unable to consent to. I set that to yes, because basically in my environment, nobody is able to request an app, but they are able to to apply the app consent, but they are able to request one. So, and there is one admin in this case, which is me, which can approve the access. And for that, users will receive an email for the notification request and also with a reminder. And the consent request expires after 30 days. You can analyze that to 60, but 1 month should be enough for an administrator to approve this. Now, what I just did, I think that's in here. I just requested access to Zapier. So basically, I went over to Zapier, Zapier.com, if I can recall this correctly. You hit on sign up with Microsoft, and then you log on with your XP account. And then it's now going to say, we need access and your administrator doesn't allow it. Enter your justification reason. Now, just to speed this a little bit up, because sometimes it takes a while before it pops up. Actually, in the admin portal, I already did this, and then it's submitted. So your admin has been notified of your request to access this app. Now, I'm logged on as the administrator in this case, and I can go to admin consents and requests, and I can see here that
request is waiting.
Me, Johnny Bravo, has requested this because I need this app to do my daily job, because that's what users do. They just put in, I need this, and not exactly why. And from this point of view, I can say, okay, as an admin, I want to review the permission and consent. And if I would do this, I'm exactly seeing what this app does require for access. So it's requiring access to view the user's basic profile and it's maintaining access to data you have given it access to. So it's quite funny. I'm giving this app access to act on this user, on behalf of this user, to basically access data. So this is quite an heavy consent which you're giving.
Yeah.
I can hit on accept. And I will do this right now, because at this point in time, I'm basically accepting for the user that the app will be added and the user is able to use it. Now, if we, at this point in time, go then back to Zapier.
Well, this is, from an end user perspective, way more friendly as it was in the past, because it was just blocked if you disable it. So with the interaction of IT or submitting an IT help desk call, you can actually submit your request and then it can be approved.
Yeah, correct.
But what I just see it, you are approving it via the Azure portal. As an admin or approver, can you also receive an email or an email notification, or is it just within the portal?
No, I do receive an email notification. But the thing is, on this account, I don't have email.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it should be
mailed. You receive as an administrator an email notification. So no need to worry about that. And the user receives now a notification as well that this app has been approved, so that he's able to use it. Now, as you now can see, and I just did this on purpose, I hit on approve, but I basically not approved this for the user. I approved it as an admin. So basically, it's not only for that one user, because otherwise it was a user consent. I just approved it for the whole tenant.
Yeah.
So if user X goes to Zapier right now, he doesn't need to consent anymore. Basically, Zapier is now able to access data on behalf of any user from the Zapier tool. So that's quite an access consent which you can give. Now, I can imagine that from an admin perspective, you don't want to be bothered with loads of admin consent requests, because for reading just the user's profile, or for reading just, well, to sign in as the user, well, I think that in most cases you can trust the app, as long as it is not able to access data. From my point of view, you're good, because this is what has been there for a long time, and it's a user consent. It's never an admin consent for your whole tenant. So the user is doing that is consenting only to access his user information. Now, if you go to consent and user permissions, now the setting we just saw was grayed out on top of the window, and that's because I actually said here, allow users to consent for apps from verified publishers for selected permissions. That's what I said on allow. That's also okay. Now looking at the permission classification, and in this case I didn't do this yet, I can select the permissions I allow the user to consent to on his own, like sign in and read user profile, sign users in, view users basic profile, and view users email address. Well, those are the most common use permissions as seen by Microsoft. And then you can basically say, yes, add selected permissions. But if this is not enough, you can click on add permissions and you can add way more permissions. If you look,
but actually what you are showing here, Pim, is you can pre-populate as an administrator. You can pre-approve the permissions from where you say that's okay to me as an organization. We fine with that. And then your end user, when he is requesting access for a certain application and it falls within the scope of your pre-approved permissions, then it will be automatically consented.
Yeah, exactly. So I just it's basically the user requests one of these 4 permissions classifications. Yeah. If it falls beneath those 4 permissions, the user is able to consent to on his own without any admin interference. If it's more permissions, so it's accessing access to data, you still have to file a request. Yeah. And with this, as an administrator, you can protect the environment because, well, it's your data and the user is consenting to it. So it's quite critical and quite important to do that in the right way. And the only thing what you need to do is basically go to the admin consents and basically review what is in here and approve where needed. And if you think it's safe to do it, then just do it.
Interesting. I see access review. Is the access review, is that based on reviewing access to from a user perspective to the application, or is it more reviewing an application you have consented in the past and say, well, I'm still trusting that enterprise application in my tenant?
No, this is an access review via identity governance. Just if you still do need access to the application in this case. Unfortunately, it's not the consent. It's not the consent.
Oh, I can imagine if sometimes when I'm in the field, I'm coming with customers which they were a little bit lazy about the app consent, didn't configure it properly, and once they configure it in the right way, they still have to revise. From my personal view, the applications they consented in the past, because I can imagine what we discussed already. Some applications might be malicious, or they having too much permissions in your tenant. That might be a potential risk.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with you, Ronnie. But yeah, that's unfortunately something you need to grab out today, as in today with PowerShell, because there is no global overview with a risk by marking the app as basically not safe, or putting an exclamation mark behind it, like please check this because we think it's not right, the permissions the app has. What you can do on the other hand, you can check the usage, and based on the usage you can maybe you can't, but in most cases you can see that the apps which are not used that much, and I'm the only user in this environment, so please know that stats are a little bit weird in here. But you can see that some apps are rarely used, and maybe that should be already the trigger, if it's not a Microsoft built-in app, to review the app, because if just one single user has access to that, why is that still needed? Is it maybe per accident where the user something clicked on, and maybe you can even clean it up?
Yeah, I get your point, but Pim, what if an application is misused? Then you will see that in that overview, it's highly utilized, and from your way of thinking, then it seems to be valid, which isn't the case.
Yeah, correct. I do agree with you. But it's just important, if it's not configured right now, block it and make sure that the consent and permissions are set. That's what the most important thing is to start with, as in today, or preferably yesterday actually. And once that's in place and once the process is there, then just go over the apps which are in there and check them what kind of permissions they have to see. Well, if you still agree with the permissions which are actually not being haven't been reviewed in the past.
Cool.
That's the stuff about the consents and permissions. Now, I just turned this on, and I think, but that's something I need to check. Yeah, so I'm using Sessionize with my regular user account, and from here I can see, for example, that I as a user, Pim, as in me, has consented access to to do this, to let Sessionize sign users in, view the user's email address, view user's basic profile, and sign in a read user profile. But that's just for my user, as you can see.
Yeah.
Now, as you just saw with the Johnny Bravo user on this end, he still needed to request access. So let's now pick Sessionize as this user and say, let's log in. I'm using Office 365. It's trying to sign me in, and oh yeah, I'm not allowed to do that because it's saying maintain access to data you have given it access to. So although the permission is view users basic profile, and that's allowed, I still need to put in a request because it's maintaining access to data you have given it access to. And that's based on the permissions set on, oh, it's a different browser, Pim. Set min content and permissions within the permission classification. So something is missing in here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I was just being able to
log in.
Yeah, exactly. Just finish this one up.
And I think that it's pretty good example of how that's working, and in fine-grained, controlled way as an admin or as for your organization to maintain this.
Yeah, exactly. Totally true. So that's that was the stuff about the enterprise apps.
Perhaps you can show us, you're showing about the UI when it comes to automation using PowerShell of Graph API. Do you have also some examples how to utilize those app registrations?
App registrations or enterprise apps?
Enterprise apps, yeah, just kidding.
Yeah, so let's log on as an administrator to my tenant. Oh, that's the wrong password. Yeah, so in here, so let's pick one application. So in simple words, let's pick Slack, for example. Now, for Slack, if I want to retrieve the enterprise application settings which are within Azure AD, I can copy the object ID and I can say get -Azure AD service principal. Dash object ID, and I type in the number which is stated to me in the window.
Yeah.
And then you can see I get Slack. I can list what the settings are on the service principal, so I can easily see that it's using SAML in this case. And in here, well, those are the settings which are basically configured within the service principal. If I want to find the app registration, I cannot use this object ID.
You cannot.
No, it's a different object ID. The application ID, if there is an app registration for Slack, then the application ID is the same. So I will show that in a minute. Now, the application ID is 9, starts with 19, ends with D6. The object ID, however, something completely different.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, I can see it.
This is not a service principal. So this is an get Azure AD application object ID. This is a total different object ID, but it's although 19C. Well, it's the same application ID. So basically, these two are, well, hang together. They can't work without each other.
You can see the service principal type is also an application above there.
Yeah. So if you look at the application, you can see there are also different things set. So indeed, in here you can even see the OAuth2 permissions, allow the application to access Slack on behalf of the signed end user. So there are different settings configured on the application and on the service principal. But for Slack, they basically, in simple words, work together for the Slack app. Now, what maybe is even more interesting is using so in the past we were using service accounts to access the PowerShell window, but these days you can use service principals, and a service principal is, well, it's different, but you can compare it to a service account, which we have seen in the past. At least that's the comparison I make.
Yeah, is it the successor or replacement? In the past, you had an application and ID with a secret key, and based on that, you could connect to the application. Now you are using a service principal to connect to the application, or?
Yeah, you use a service principal in this case. So if I would, I created one. So I created a test service principal. That's just a name. It's a very wrong name. It was just a test. And I've given it permissions. So basically I manually created this application. I just hit on new application, created one my own. I named it test service principal. And I gave this a service principal, or actually an enterprise application, but it's a service principal. I gave it some permissions, even as an admin. Now, the way where you can do this, and this is where they work together. So the service principal is created in here. You cannot add permissions in here because there is no way you can click on add right here.
Yeah.
You created it for the enterprise applications. You go back to the app registrations. You hit on test service principal, and you go to the API permissions, and in here you can add permissions.
Yeah.
And in here you can also say, let's put a certificate on it, or let's put a client secret on it. Now, the client secret can be compared to the username and the password. So where the username for the service principal is the application ID.
Yeah.
Application ID, and that's the username, and where the token, the client secret is basically the password. In very simple words. Now, when doing that, we don't like username and passwords for regular user accounts. So we also should not like this for
don't use this
for service principals. So you are allowed to use client secrets, but use it in a way where you first say, always first certificates, where it's possible. If it's not possible, I will use a client secret. And then the way how you can use this to connect to your application is by saying, and I need to think this through because I don't do this a lot. Via the regular PowerShell, I mostly use automation to do this. So I need the tenant ID. I need the application ID. to connect. And I need the certificate thumbprint. And now I'm connected. So you can see I'm connected with the service principal.
Yeah,
so in simple words, I can connect to the Azure ID without the username and the password by using the tenant ID, the application ID, and the certificate thumbprint. And I think you maybe think right now, well, this is not very much different than using the secret key. Well, that's somehow true, but the thing is, this certificate is added to the store on my computer. So if I go to the certificate snap-in,
it's only trusted from your computer. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. I think is this one, or is it ending on? Oh no, I already know what I did. It's using A6, D, etc. And if you look it up in here, it's also 6D. So there's the match. So
yeah, you can only use it safely when you have this certificate on your computer. Otherwise, it won't work.
Yeah. And if you delete it from here, basically, well, let me do that right now. Let's disconnect first.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, disconnect Azure ID. That's better. And then let's say connect. And I'm not allowed to connect anymore because the certificate was gone. So I can manage it from the service principal still does exist, but I can easily manage how to do this and how to go over this. And I can do the same with the client secrets, but this is a lot different to connect to, because you basically I will copy that over to the screen in the clean note.
And I believe you can also use the key vault as well for automation perspective in a way to automatically connect and perform activities, isn't it?
Yeah, you can store these values in the key vault indeed, but then still something needs access to that key vault. But anyway, it's a safe way to store them in Azure within a key vault indeed. Now we just saw the certificate-based one. That should always be the preferred one for the client secret to connect to. And then I'm using the same module, of course. Well, no, not totally true. I use Azure RM account, but in this case, the application ID is still the same. But in this case, we need to put in the service principal key as a secure string. This is the service principal. And as you can see, that's matching the one below. I create the credentials and then I can put it in as service principal credentials, Azure credentials, tenant ID, and this should be, I'm not sure why this is missing, but it should be application ID. And that's then the way you can connect to this with a client secret instead of a certificate. Now, for all the watchers, unfortunately, I'm going to delete the client secret. Otherwise, you will be able to access my tenant. So that's how you can work with, on the other end, with enterprise applications and service principals to provide access to, or maybe build a script which you want to use within your tenant to grab some information or to actually configure some information. It all depends on the access rights. Yeah, access rights you configure. So in here, I chose for read directory data, but also read and write. So basically, I can read and write directory data. And then in the simple thing, I can, for example, say, I will also provide permissions to maybe something funny, to write the user authentication methods to the Azure AD. So if I want to do that with this service principal, I can simply hit add the permission, and I can, as you can see, there is no admin consent, and then I can apply the admin consent, and now if I connect via the Azure AD or via the graph, I was able with this service principal to request this information. So if you're using, for example, connect-azure AD within a script and you want to grab it like I just did, you also need to apply the permissions in the right way, because otherwise you literally have no permissions to read anything or set anything. So that's in I think in a nice benefit as well to think about when not only moving applications to the Azure AD, but also transforming service accounts, which you maybe today bypassed for MFA, to transition them to a service principal, because a service principal, I can use them with PowerShell, but I'm not able to use them via the UI, because it's not a valid username which is accepted on portal.office.com, for example.
Yeah, you can compare it with an interactive logon, which is not the case in this case.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah, that's quite interesting and quite insightful. How applications, whether it's enterprise application and app registration, works in Azure AD. And yeah, what I mentioned and what you showed us, Pim, there's so much you can do with these applications. That's I think we know Azure AD and we know all the good stuff like privileged identity management, conditional access, MFA, and so on. But yeah, with applications, it's powerful as well, and I think it's good to know, and that's why I did this session. We choose this topic. Giving the better understanding of applications, how you can use it, and evenly also how you don't use them in the right way there.
Yeah, totally true. So I actually hope that this triggers a lot of IT administrators to review the settings within the tenant and configure that consent and permissions in the right way, so that not every user is able to consent to data, to his data, basically, because it's not all the company data. And to protect it in the right way, because, well, as hackers do know, we are going to protect accounts with MFA, but they find ways as well to work around that. So just protect things in the right way and keep your data safe. That's basically my message for all the administrators. And I hope you enjoyed listening and learned a lot actually from this session. So.
Well, I do, Pim. Even we are facing this day to day almost with our customers, but even with your explanation, it's way more clear to me. Also, the differences between user consent and admin consent, and the way you can pre-consent your tenant, and that's interesting. Thanks, Pim, for this great insights.
No problem, Ronnie. A lot of pleasure, of course.
Let's. I would say that was it for today. Let's wrap it up. It's almost, we are nearing by I believe Ignite. It's by starting early of March. And to give you already a cliffhanger, for the next section will be the fourth session of the TechTalk dudes. We have, of course, some great topics about endpoint management. So I'm looking forward to it, Pim.
I do as well, Ronnie. And let's keep it a bit of a surprise for the people who are listening. So to be honest, that's one thing we at least can give away, is that if it's right, we have someone from Microsoft, the Microsoft Program Manager, on some killer feature, I would say. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. Yeah.